The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a federally funded collaborative initiative of leading research and clinical institutions integrated with community-level treatment centers. The network's mission is to raise the standard of care and improve access to services for traumatized children, their families, and communities throughout the United States. To learn more, please visit our website.
All children and adults actively participating in the production of this video have completed an informed consent process and have volunteered freely to participate in this project. Children depicted in this production are either actors or survivors of childhood traumatic grief who have completed and are no longer in active treatment. We thank them for their participation and contributions to this video. You are looking at the images of fear, helplessness, confusion, and even terror. Feelings that occur when children unexpectedly experience the traumatic death of a loved one. While it is certainly true that death is a part of life, the pain of losing a loved one can sometimes consume the lives of our children in ways that we are just beginning to understand. And so, as parents, teachers, and healthcare professionals, as a community, and as a country, we are obligated to help our kids when they need it most. It is our job to reach out, to help our children heal, and to remind them that it's okay to remember.
This is Dr. Cohen.
Dr. Judith Cohen is Medical Director of the Center for Traumatic Stress in Children and Adolescents at Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh. Since 1981, she and her colleagues have been treating children and families forced to deal with the traumatic death of a loved one due to such circumstances as shootings, stabbings, drug-related deaths, and the devastating impact of inner-city gang violence. In 1994, however, the center was confronted with a new challenge that resulted in looking at the phenomena of traumatic loss even more closely. Late in the afternoon on September 8th, U.S. Air Flight 427 crashed outside of Pittsburgh, killing everyone on board. In the weeks and months that followed, Dr. Cohen and her colleagues witnessed firsthand the emotional devastation the tragedy had caused. It was their job to counsel many of the grieving children whose parents unexpectedly died that day.
The crash of Flight 427 was the first time that we had a community-level trauma in which large numbers of children lost their parents and other loved ones under very traumatic circumstances. From these children and families, we learned that in circumstances where children experience both trauma and death, that it's very important for us to address both the trauma and loss, grief issues together. This was a turning point for our program because we started to systematically think about how to treat childhood traumatic grief, how to recognize it, and how best to address those problems in children.
The tragedy of Flight 427 was an extraordinary occurrence that profoundly affected the work of the team in Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, traumatic events are more widespread than we often realize. Traumatic losses impact children across the country every day as a result of accidental death, community violence, medical trauma, war, natural disasters, motor vehicle accidents, and other unpredictable traumatic events. As our awareness of traumatic grief continues to grow, clinicians and researchers are trying to understand the impact on our nation's children and families and the best ways to help them. We know children grieve, often very deeply. Experts also know that left unaddressed, traumatic grief can interfere with later development and potentially lead to serious emotional, social, and behavioral problems in adolescence or adulthood. Dr. Alicia Lieberman is director of the Child Trauma Research Project at San Francisco General Hospital. She has written and lectured extensively and is a consultant to government agencies and private foundations nationally and abroad. Dr. Lieberman specializes in treating traumatized children ages 5 and under.
It's quite common for young children to experience the death of a loved one in the early years, actually much more common than we had originally anticipated.
Perhaps most painful of all is when a child loses a parent. It is estimated that 5% of all children in the U.S. experience the death of a parent before the age of 15. Further, at least 60,000 children experience the suicidal death of a relative across our nation each year.
We are finding, for example, that children under 3 are often present when a sibling or a parent dies in traumatic circumstances. These are often young children with young parents, and so we have to remember that young parents don't usually die because of chronic illness. They die because of accidents or because of domestic violence or in community violence.
The death of a parent or caregiver is an especially difficult event for a child. Because of the significance of the parent-child relationship, children who lose a parent are likely to face particular challenges. For this reason, it may be especially important to ensure that the child is supported and offered any needed help and intervention for traumatic grief reactions.
Children are much more vulnerable to the effects of a traumatic death because particularly when they are dependent on the person who died, at the moment of the death, their tendency is to turn to the caregiver for help, and so the child is left to his own devices, and young children have very undeveloped emotional and cognitive resources to cope with traumatic circumstances. They really need adults to help them cope with their feelings. Because when a child is not developing well, the child can really move from a healthy developmental trajectory to a self-defeating trajectory with long-term consequences into adulthood.
In some cases, when children experience traumatic grief reactions and do not receive appropriate help or treatment, they can develop more serious problems that can impact their development and relationships throughout their lives. Childhood traumatic grief is a condition that children may develop after a loved one dies under circumstances that they perceive as traumatic.
Childhood traumatic grief is a condition in which children who lose loved ones under very unexpected, frightening, terrifying, traumatic circumstances develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress and other trauma symptoms which interfere with their ability to progress through typical grief tasks because they're stuck on the traumatic aspects of the death. This prevents them from being able to grieve the loss of their loved one and can affect them in profound ways that can last the rest of their lives. Bob Pynus was one of the few people who had discussed helping children with that condition.
Dr. Robert Pynus is a nationally recognized expert on children and trauma. He was a lead consultant after the Oklahoma City bombing and the Columbine shootings. Today, he is co-director of the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress.
Many years ago, when I began some of this work with children who had witnessed a parent's murder, I worked with an 11-year-old girl, just about 12, who had been at home asleep in her bedroom when an estranged boyfriend, for whom there had been a restraining order, came in after many months away and shot and killed her mother on the living room sofa, awakening her so that she actually became a witness to the killing as well as to the aftermath. She found the challenges of this death very difficult afterwards. It was hard for her to talk about a mother who she dearly loved without going back to what it was like to be in that room. What happens afterwards when you're in that circumstance is the focus is on your mom's been killed, not on what it was like to be standing at the door and frozen in place, worried for yourself as well as for what's happening to your mother. No one was helping her with that.
Lisa was emotionally stuck back at the scene of the murder. Normal life experiences became reminders of the event, often triggering self-destructive behaviors.
If you've seen a fight escalate into a death, then anytime you see conflict, you may expect it to escalate into something much more serious, which means you won't engage in some of the normal daily things that might have to go on in interpersonal life that can have a constructive outcome. Violent experiences can interrupt gaining that competency. But you need that for school. You need that for later life. You need that for later events that happen in life.
Another common symptom of childhood traumatic grief is depression.
But depression is a common occurrence after traumatic bereavement. So you now have a child who may have both traumatic stress and depressive conditions, which can take a real heavy toll on child development and may carry long-term consequences for the child.
An unexpected death, particularly when it is traumatic, generates what we call secondary adversities, which are unexpected stresses in the way the family conducts the everyday life of the family and of the child.
Secondary adversities can include such challenging issues as a change in the primary caregiver for the child, a change in the child's place of residence or school, a disruption to the family's financial stability, or even involvement with law enforcement or the judicial system.
All these are questions that the family is grappling with, often without guidance, and it's important for the therapist to raise these questions and to participate as a partner in coming up with decisions that will be supportive of the child.
We now know that the thousands of children who witness the violent or traumatic death of a loved one every year are extremely vulnerable. Without careful intervention, the symptoms of childhood traumatic grief could have lifelong consequences that impact not just the child, but also families, friends, and communities. How can children become unstuck from dwelling on the traumatic circumstances of the death? There are established treatments for bereavement and post-traumatic stress disorder. In the past decade, researchers have begun to adapt them for the treatment of childhood traumatic grief. In September of 2001, this groundwork proved vital. More than 10% of New York City public school students had family members who were involved in some way in the World Trade Center attacks. For these children, it was a traumatic experience unlike any they had ever seen before. Dr. Robin Goodman had worked for many years with child cancer patients. Following the attack on the World Trade Center, she collaborated with an expert in trauma, Dr. Alyssa Brown, to develop a clinical and research program for bereaved children and families of the 9/11 disaster. Their work was based on previous research done by colleagues in Pittsburgh and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The tragedy provided an opportunity to apply the best research to real-world problems.
Working with bereaved children who have been bereaved for all different reasons, you start to realize that some do better and some are not doing better after a period of time. and you wonder why. And when 9/11 happened, there was a big group of children that all had a very specific traumatic experience. And then it started to make sense that the traumatic aspect of that kind of a death really might be what's interfering with kids' ability to kind of grieve in a what we think of as typical and sometimes helpful way. When children had an experience like this, you realize it's a rather significant event in their life. What you want to help them do is figure out a way to integrate the experience into their life and have it become part of their life as they move on, not the only part of their life. Working with children bereaved by 9/11, you really got to see this kind of a condition where there were constant reminders in the media, there were street namings, there were TV shows, there were books, and those prompted and triggered all sorts of reactions in kids and their parents. After 9/11, it was very clear how a traumatic situation can really affect one's reactions to the loss and death of someone that's so special and makes it more complicated.
Researchers and clinicians who have worked with and studied children experiencing traumatic grief reactions have found that children's reactions to traumatic reminders about the person who died or reminders of how the person died can be particularly challenging. The child may become distressed when different people, places, or situations trigger upsetting thoughts and memories. In therapy, the child comes to identify and understand the triggers and how to cope with them. Experts on child traumatic grief have identified 3 main types of traumatic reminders that can be distressing for children.
There are 3 kinds of reminders that children may experience which can cause symptoms or difficulties. The first is a trauma reminder, and a trauma reminder is any person, place, situation, or prompt that will make the child think about the traumatic nature of the death. The other kinds of reminders are loss reminders and change reminders. Loss reminders are any situation or person or place that reminds the child of the person who's died. The third type of reminder is a change reminder, and this is related to secondary adversities that children may experience as a result of the death of a parent or other loved one. A change reminder is anything that reminds the child that their circumstances in life have changed as a result of the person's death. So trauma, loss, and change reminders can segue into trauma symptoms and can interfere with the child's ability to grieve the deceased person. If children don't address the trauma reminders, either by creating a trauma narrative or through some other method of directly confronting their traumatic memories, they are likely to avoid those reminders. This can lead to children believing that they don't have an ability to cope with upsetting feelings, so that the only way to cope is by avoiding or even becoming emotionally numb.
Clinicians and researchers from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, representing diverse professional backgrounds and areas of expertise, have collaborated and agreed on the most helpful aspects of treatment for childhood traumatic grief. The treatment incorporates elements used by experts with a more traditional psychotherapy approach and those using a more structured, skills-based format. These intervention techniques have been shown to be effective and should be individualized to the family's personal and cultural beliefs. Treatment should also be adapted to the specific needs of young children, groups, and teens. It is often best to help the child experiencing childhood traumatic grief cope with both the trauma and the grief-related reactions. In the context of a strong and trusting therapeutic relationship, the child and therapist can begin the gradual process of coping with a traumatic loss. One way this is done is by first helping the child and parent learn specific skills for managing distressing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, such as their worries, guilt, nightmares, or avoidance. A beginning step is to teach the child to identify and better control his or her reactions to unpleasant reminders and memories. Only when the clinician believes the child has gained these new skills and is ready, the child begins the process of confronting his or her traumatic experience in a safe, trusting, and controlled environment. One method for helping the child deal with a traumatic death is by having the child tell his or her story through the creation of a trauma narrative. A trauma narrative can be told in words, drawings, or other creative activities appropriate to the child's interest and developmental level. Completing the narrative can help reduce traumatic grief reactions and allows the child to better engage in healthy activities focused on more positive memories. Lauren entered therapy after witnessing the death of her young sister. After a gradual process where Lauren's therapist worked with her to identify and cope with distressing traumatic reminders and memories, Lauren was ready to address what happened to her sister. Lauren worked closely with her therapist to describe her painful experience in the form of a trauma narrative. What follows is an example of how a trauma narrative was utilized as part of a successful treatment experience. The narrative of Lauren's memories is told in her own words and drawings.
My sister died on September 27, 2000. She was 5.5 years old.
On a day like any other, 8-year-old Lauren was playing on a second-floor sun porch with her younger sister, Kelsey. Lauren briefly left the porch. When she returned, she couldn't find her sister.
I looked around the house and she wasn't there.
Kelsey had climbed through a window of the porch and fallen from a second-story window to the ground below.
I went outside to see if Kelsey was okay. I was staring at her. Her eyes were closed.
Lauren immediately ran to get her father.
Daddy, Kelsey's on the ground. We went outside. My dad was holding Kelsey's head. I felt sad and a little scared.
They called the ambulance and waited the long minutes for it to arrive.
In Lauren's case, her parents brought her to therapy about 6 months after the death of her sister, and she still experienced, as you would expect, a lot of anxiety, sadness, nightmares, difficulty sleeping, and even some avoidance. She avoided playing in the backyard, for example, because that's where she found her sister. Every time she would experience a daily reminder of her sister, just even a positive memory, that would simultaneously trigger the traumatic memories so that the usual grieving process would be halted or interrupted. So creating this trauma narrative is a way to help the child, guide the child through telling their story, just a little at a time, gently guiding them through it, but always encouraging them to move forward. I don't think people, particularly children, have the ability to just walk their way instinctively through those trauma responses. It really needs a special kind of guidance.
The trauma narrative is just one step in the process of healing. The full therapy process can take many months.
I think parent involvement in this treatment protocol is really critical. It also happens to be very complicated because oftentimes the parent or caregiver is having their own traumatic grief response.
Lauren's father rode to the hospital in the ambulance with Kelsey. Driven by a neighbor, Lauren followed. At the hospital, Lauren and her parents waited together while Kelsey was in the operating room. Finally, the doctor emerged and conveyed the awful news.
I mean, we definitely weren't prepared. I mean, you read it in the paper, things happen, you always think it's not going to happen to you, it's not going to happen to us. I mean, we feel we're pretty good parents, watch our kids, and then, you know, an accident happens. You don't get to say goodbye. You know, so many things you just don't get to experience. And if we wouldn't have sought help, I don't think our family would have lasted. I mean, there's times I didn't even want to get out of bed, but I have Lauren. I couldn't see going through what we did without making sure that she did get the help she needed. And by her going, it helped all of us.
We watch Lauren grow every day, and Kelsey's just still, you know, Kelsey. She'll always be 5 years old, and that's really hard that she's not going to grow up. I mean, she'd be 9 years old today.
Another important thing we know about kids in this situation is you can't always tell by looking. So what you have to do is look at how they're behaving, sometimes what they're not saying or what they're not doing. Parents and professionals and teachers have to look at their children and think about what might be going on that is unspoken. Unfortunately, there's often a tendency to think either that kids will get over something that's awful or that it wasn't that bad for a child. And both of those kinds of attitudes aren't helpful for kids that have childhood traumatic grief.
Because violence and trauma are often concentrated in urban neighborhoods, there are hundreds of communities across the country faced with the reality of childhood traumatic grief every day. Traumatic loss is one of many types of trauma faced by our nation's children. Exposure to trauma can also result from such issues as community and domestic violence, abuse, maltreatment, medical trauma, natural disasters, and other traumatic events. The problem of child traumatic stress is so prevalent that the U.S. federal government decided to take action and form the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The network was established in 2001 through a congressional initiative and is administered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It spans the nation and includes the expertise of leading universities, hospitals, and community treatment centers. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network allows experts such as Drs. Cohen, Goodman, Lieberman, and Pinus to collaborate effectively in establishing standardized treatments for childhood traumatic grief and other forms of child traumatic stress. The network's mission is to raise the standard of care and improve access to services for traumatized children and families across our nation.
The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a very unique federal legislation. It's unique in a number of different ways. First of all, it's a very large child mental health initiative addressing a population of children and families that often has not gotten much attention within our society. We know that very few children who have these kinds of experiences are getting care right now.
We have some preliminary evidence that the kinds of treatment we're discussing are effective in decreasing not only children's traumatic grief, but also their post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, their depression, their anxiety, their behavior problems, and we also have some information that suggests that parents who participate in this treatment also resolve their own post-traumatic stress disorder and depressive symptoms.
Through efforts of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, we are beginning to make great strides in the treatment of child traumatic stress reactions, such as child traumatic grief. We know that every child is unique, and each responds differently based on culture, developmental level, and other variables. But in the end, they all have one thing in common. They are suffering and need our help. Medical and mental health professionals have learned much from the violent events of recent decades, both about the effect of trauma on kids and ways to help. As the word spreads, fewer and fewer kids and families will suffer.
We hope that for children with traumatic grief, once they've completed treatment, although the traumatic loss will always be a sad memory, it will be something that hopefully will make them stronger, that they can grow from, and particularly we hope that they will see it as only one event in their lives rather than making their central identity one of a victim.
Children are having to deal with very adult-sized problems these days in terms of violence and trauma and death. And it really takes the adults to show these kids where they can get help and that it's okay to get help. Because kids really depend on the grown-ups to take care of them and do the right thing.
More than just the facts of the death, what truly it's like to be under those circumstances. But to allow yourself to get into that world. It's not an easy world to get into. It's one that all of us would rather not be happening to anyone. But we've learned to not only to legitimize and understand, but to appreciate the complexity of those experiences and the ways in which being helped with the reminders of trauma and the loss reminders, how children come out on the other side, so that they come out with extremely constructive views about how they'd like to make the world better.
Lauren and her parents successfully completed therapy. While the memory of Kelsey's death will always be with them, as a family, they have made this experience into a positive part of their lives. Now in a position to help others struggling with similar problems, Lauren and her parents were pleased to share their story for the making of this video. In fact, the song you are listening to was written by Lauren's father in honor of Kelsey.
I think of you, I think of you.
Amidst the problems of today's society, a vision is emerging. While we will never be able to completely eliminate the suffering in our children's lives, every day we are learning that there are ways to help. Every day, parents, teachers, and healthcare professionals all across the country are proving that help is on the way. Together, as we strive for a brighter future, we can help our children understand that there is hope, that they can heal, and it's okay to remember. If you are a parent, caregiver, or other concerned adult worried about a child who may be experiencing childhood traumatic grief reactions, please consult with a qualified medical or mental health care provider who works with children in your community. Practitioners are strongly encouraged to seek out additional consultation, training, and supervision in order to develop your expertise related to childhood traumatic grief and its treatment. For additional resources, please consult the companion training video and print curriculum.
Think of how much you like your mother. Very loving and caring, you were like no other. Think of you before I go to sleep, and thank God it's the end of the day and the last I'll weep. Think of how much you were like your mother, very caring and loving like no other. Think of you, I think of you.